I love the B-52 as much as anybody. Actually, strike that, I probably love it more. So it brings me absolutely no joy to say this, but it's time we started planning to send these bombing behemoths out to pasture. America's mighty B-52 Stratofortress has been in service for well over 70 years now, and with a wide array of upgrades ongoing, it's pretty likely that the buff, as it's known to many in uniform, will serve all the way up to, and maybe even beyond, its century mark. But despite all the memes about the B-52 flying forever, some of which I have to admit I have even made myself, the truth is, these aging jets are definitely not immortal, and the Air Force is already starting to suffer the pains of keeping its geriatric bomber fleet in the fight. But in order to understand why America needs to field a new B-52, even with the incredibly capable B-21 Raider already in production, we've got to understand what it is that makes this bomber so special. I mean, there is a reason the B-52 is expected to outlive both of the heavy payload strategic bombers that America designed to replace it. So, let's talk about what makes the B-52 arguably the best bomber design in history, why we might wish it could fly forever, and why we need to start planning, like right now, to replace it. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. In 1952, everything the world knew about bombers was changing. Up until that point, the only bomber on the planet with truly intercontinental range was America's gargantuan B-36 Peacemaker, which had entered service only 4 years earlier but could already be seen as a relic of a bygone era. A time when bombers were powered by piston engines, under straight wings, at speeds that you could achieve in a high-performance sports car today. The B-36, of course, did later add 4 J-47 turbojet engines to increase its short-range sprint speeds, but the Air Force still had no illusions about the Peacemaker's longevity, especially in the face of newly emerging air defense technology being developed by both the Americans and the Soviets at the time. Radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, the first of which actually entered production for Uncle Sam that very year. So, with the calculus of air warfare shifting beneath them and the Soviet Union eager to close the nuclear bomber gap, both Cold Warring states produced new, long-range heavy payload bombers for testing that same year in 1952. And oddly enough, both nations opted to place their bets on what were basically American designs. You see, back during World War II, the US had spent around $2 billion developing the atomic bomb, but it spent around $3 billion developing the bomber that delivered it, the B-29 Superfortress. And the Soviets knew what a big deal the B-29 was. They even requested their own B-29s through the Lend-Lease program. But when they were rebuffed and a handful of damaged American B-29s were forced to land in Soviet territory, well, the Soviets just kept them, tore them apart, and reverse-engineered them into the Tupolev Tu-4. Now, these B-29 replicas lacked the range to deliver atomic bombs to American soil. So, first, the Soviets scaled up the design into the larger Tu-85 before ultimately choosing to just use everything that they learned from both of those efforts to produce the new and broadly capable Tu-95, which was powered by 4 huge NK-12 turboprop engines that they had developed with the help of German engineers they'd brought over in the Soviet equivalent to Operation Paperclip. In effect, the Tu-95 was sort of the bastard child of the by then dated B-29 and the efforts of the Tupolev Design Bureau, but dated doesn't mean ineffective, and the Tu-95 could carry nuclear bombs to targets more than 5,000 miles away with just a single mid-flight refueling, and it could do it at cruising speeds that almost matched the jet-supported sprint speeds of America's B-36 at well over 400 miles per hour. But while the Soviets were working out how to mash their new turboprops into an overgrown B-29, their American counterparts were leaping headlong into the jet age, adopting the 35-degree wing sweep of their brand new at the time jet-powered B-47 medium-range bomber, but scaling it up by nearly 60% into a whopping 185-foot wingspan, under which Boeing slung 8 of the most powerful turbojet engines in the world. Pratt & Whitney's J-57s, which gave this jet-powered bomber a combined 84,000 pounds of thrust and the ability to push that to 96,000 pounds using water injection. Now, this bomber's massive swept wings, which, if they were straight, would have extended to only about 10 feet shy of the gigantic B-36's wingspan, were built using the latest in material science and manufacturing technology of their day, making the wings flexible enough to deflect through a 32-foot arc while still being strong enough to haul 43,000 pounds of munitions at speeds as high as 630 miles per hour. Now, both of these bombers made their maiden flights in 1952, and both went into production that same year. But from a technological standpoint, they were already decades apart, with the Soviets seemingly looking backward, and the Americans leaning as far forward as their budgets would let them. Between 1952 and 1962, Boeing pumped out an average of one new B-52 bomber every 5 days, ultimately building a total of 744 aircraft. And at the fleet's peak in 1963, Uncle Sam had 650 operational B-52s scattered on runways across 38 air bases around the world. And while many saw the B-52 at the time primarily as a means of nuclear deterrence and force projection, the bomber quickly demonstrated its value in other, lesser discussed but equally important roles. In fact, the 10th B-52 ever assembled, lovingly dubbed Balls 8 thanks to its NASA tail number of 008, served solely as a testbed aircraft for new technologies from the time it was delivered in 1955 all the way until its retirement in 2004. And over those 49 years, this single aircraft arguably saw more aviation history made than any other platform that's ever been built. I mean, I could talk about this reconnaissance bomber for the rest of the night, but let's just leave it at this. The first mission Balls 8 ever flew in 1955 was to launch the X-15 manned rocket plane that could fly as fast as Mach 6.7. And the last mission it flew, in 2004, was to launch the X-43 air-breathing scramjet technology demonstrator that hit Mach 9.6. And it's got a long list of pretty incredible stories in between. Of course, a lot has changed since these bombers started flying, including, well, the bombers themselves, which have seen at least 14 significant upgrade programs and 8 overhauls substantial enough to warrant new letter designations, not to mention the ongoing upgrade from today's B-52Hs into tomorrow's B-52Js. And despite the concerns that I'm going to delve into here in just a minute, you should know that the new B-52Js that are in the works right now might be trapped in bodies that rolled off Boeing's assembly line over 64 years ago. But inside that wrinkly bomber skin lies a very modern and downright scary collection of new and old air combat capabilities. At the heart of this upgrade is the Commercial Engine Replacement Program, which will replace the dated Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofans that they've been flying with since the early 1960s, with brand new Rolls-Royce produced F-130 turbofans instead. Now, these engines will give the B-52J the same combined 136,000 pounds of thrust that it's got today, but it'll do it while extending the bomber's fuel range by as much as 30% over today's B-52H, all while carrying 70,000 pounds of ordnance. In place of the bomber's existing and antiquated AN/APQ-166 mechanically scanned array radar, the B-52J will sport the new AN/APQ-188 active electronically scanned array radar, which was derived directly from the advanced arrays carried by fighters like the F/A-18 Super Hornet and the F-15EX Eagle II, meaning the B-52 bomber will soon be carrying a more advanced fire control radar than you'll find in any Russian fighter, with the possible exception of the Su-57, though its NO-36 is still a first-generation AESA, so I stand by what I said. Now, I can't mention this radar upgrade, though, without noting that 8 people were recently lost when a B-52 assigned to this radar test program crashed shortly after takeoff at Edwards Air Force Base. Now, the reason for that crash is still under investigation, but it's unlikely to have anything to do with the radar array itself. I just wanted to mention it and show my respect. Now, the B-52J is also getting a new avionics suite with the associated all-glass cockpit, an enhanced and improved communication suite with Link 16 integration, and increased automation throughout the aircraft. And that isn't just marketing bluster. The B-52 has long flown with a 5-person crew, including the flight commander, another pilot, a navigator, a radar navigator, and an electronic warfare officer. The B-52J, however, will use that increased automation to consolidate the navigator and electronic warfare role, reducing the bomber's crew requirements to 4. And, of course, with new tech making its way through testing at a cyclic rate these days, the B-52J upgrade program will also integrate a long list of new weapon systems, including the new AGM-181 Long-Range Standoff Weapon, or LRSO, which is a stealthy, nuclear-armed cruise missile meant to replace the long-serving AGM-86B. It will be, in every sense, a much more modern buff than we've ever seen before, which just goes to show how forward-leaning this incredible bomber design really was all the way back in the early 50s. And the truth is, the B-52's unique combination of massive payload capabilities, relatively high performance, and relatively low operating costs have all made it, well, pretty indispensable for the modern Air Force, stealth or not. With an unclassified service ceiling of 50,000 feet, the B-52H can fly nearly 20,000 feet higher than a lot of commercial air traffic. And with a modern disclosed top speed of 650 miles per hour, the B-52 is faster than the A-10 Warthog, and it can even outrun the F-117 Nighthawk at high altitude. Its 70,000-pound payload is nearly double the unclassified payload capacity of the B-2 Spirit, and while the aircraft's current external pylons are generally limited to carrying 5,000-pound class weapons, the platform is strong enough to accommodate new pylons in development right now that will be able to carry up to 20,000 pounds under wing. Now this, along with an unrefueled range of 8,800 miles, that's about 14,160 kilometers, has allowed the B-52 to maintain a firm grip on its spot in America's nuclear triad, despite lacking the stealth required to make it survivable inside modern contested airspace. Now, for anybody who may not be familiar with the nuclear triad, it's effectively America's nuclear insurance, or maybe I should say deterrence policy, that ensures America could retaliate to a nuclear first strike no matter how devastating it might be, by distributing America's nuclear arsenal between aircraft, nuclear ballistic missile submarines, and ICBMs. Even a massive attack that somehow wiped out every missile silo and airstrip in the Western world still couldn't prevent Uncle Sam from responding in kind with sub-launched weapons, and so forth. Effectively, the threat of us retaliating is theoretically supposed to be enough to prevent anyone from attempting a first strike. For its part, the B-52H is rated to carry an absolutely insane 20 AGM-86B nuclear air-launched cruise missiles, each of which use terrain contour matching navigation and a turbofan engine to deliver variable nuclear payloads of up to 150 kilotons to targets more than 1,500 miles, or more than 2,400 kilometers, away from the launching aircraft. Now, each of these weapons delivers nearly 10 times the explosive yield of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. And that means that a single B-52, delivered in 1962 and carrying weapons that entered service in 1982, can deliver as much destructive power as all of the munitions, including atomic bombs, expended by all of the nations throughout all of World War II. And it can do it from well outside the reach of enemy air defenses and even enemy combat air patrols. And just as importantly, it can do that for a relative bargain. Aircraft operating costs vary pretty widely depending on your source and what they include in the math. Some sources count only fuel and maintenance costs. Just ask Saab's Gripen marketing team. While others include everything from runway repairs to health insurance for airport security. So when comparing the costs of aircraft operations, again, I'm looking at you, Gripen, it's important to pull them from the same source to make sure the calculations include the same things. For our purposes today, we'll look to the fairly all-encompassing figures from the Government Accountability Office, which shows the B-52H rings in at around $88,354 per hour to fly, which is more than 52% less than the B-2 Spirit at $150,741 per hour, and it's nearly 65% less than the supersonic B-1B Lancer at a whopping $173,014 per hour. Now that means you could very literally fly 2 B-52s for the cost of flying 1 B-1B. And that has a lot to do with why the Air Force envisions its bomber force of the future as consisting of new B-21 Raiders and upgraded B-52Js, while the B-1B and B-2 eventually fly off into the sunset. Now, when people ask me why the B-52 is sticking around while more modern bombers are being sent off to pasture, I usually turn to cars and trucks that we're all more familiar with here on the ground for an analogy. Now, the B-2 Spirit and the new B-21 Raider could be thought of as high-end luxury sports cars, like a BMW M5 or an Audi RS7. They are objectively great platforms, chock full of advanced technology and all the bells and whistles that you can imagine. But all that power under the hood means you gotta run premium gas. And of course, maintenance and repairs cost a ton. And every one of those gadgets eventually wears out and has to be replaced for a pretty penny. The B-1B Lancer, then, is more like a Dodge Charger Hellcat. What it lacks in terms of the B-2 and B-21's stealthy refinement, it makes up for with brute force. Dumping power out the back via rear tires that are more than a foot wide and burn almost as well as the Lancer's 4 F-101 turbofans. And that makes the B-52 an old turbo diesel pickup. Sure, it's not the right choice for a job that's better suited to a BMW or a Hellcat, but it'll run forever, tow just about anything, and do a lot of stuff that you wouldn't dream of trying in those other cars. It isn't that the B-52 is better than the B-1B or the B-2 because, well, better is a relative term, but there is no denying that running that old pickup is a lot cheaper, and broadly speaking, having a truck bed or underwing pylons rated for 20,000 pounds worth of munitions comes in handy more often in day-to-day life than the gadgets or the speed that you can get from those other options. That's why the B-52 keeps getting a new lease on life, because as advanced, capable, and impressive as the new B-21 Raider may truly be, it will still never be able to offer the cost-effective utility of our turbo diesel B-52. That's just not what the B-21 was built for. We're not going to strap massive hypersonic boost glide weapons to underwing pylons on a bomber that was purpose-built to be the stealthiest thing to ever see the sky. There will never come a time when we look to the Raider as a cheap ferry flight for technology demonstrators or research vehicles. And the B-21 certainly can't carry 20 nuclear-armed standoff cruise missiles. Now, don't mistake that for meaning the B-21 has limited utility. It's very likely to be the most broadly capable bomber ever fielded, but like the mighty Buff, its most effective use cases are specific. The B-21 is a stand-in bomber, meaning it was designed to penetrate deep into enemy airspace and operate in relative proximity to the bad guys, not just engaging targets, but collecting real-time intelligence and coordinating the actions of other stand-in platforms. The B-52, in its modern form, is a stand-off bomber, meant to ferry huge amounts of long-range ordnance to within striking distance, deploy it, and then turn around to do it again in a cost-effective way. And having both not only gives commanders more options in a fight, it allows for more complex and overwhelming coordinated strikes that can incorporate a wide variety of high and low-cost munitions. And to be honest, that is also why the US Air Force needs to design and field a replacement for the B-52 that follows in its same utilitarian lineage, rather than chasing fancy new things like stealth, as crazy as that might sound in the modern era. You see, Uncle Sam's already got a sleek sports car of a bomber in the B-21, but he's still got to be able to haul lumber to the job site, or launch 20 ALCMs, and nothing does that quite as well as a good pickup or a B-52. Because what do you do when your trusty old work truck finally breaks down? You don't replace it with two sports cars, you replace it with a new work truck. Of course, I can already hear some of you typing, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I understand the sentiment, but I think it's born out of this idea that military aircraft are just sitting in hangars waiting for a war to break out. And that just isn't the case. These ancient jets are up there racking up hundreds of flight hours per year every year. And like any machine that's 60 to 70 years old, the wear and tear of time extends beyond the powertrain, and replacing every component slowly over years until you've built a fleet of bombers of Theseus just is not a cost-effective long-term solution. There will come a time when our sexagenarian B-52 airframes just aren't safe to fly anymore, no matter how efficient the engines are on its wings. Metal fatigue is cumulative, and that means general use will eventually kill an aircraft just as dead as any missile ever could. Or, as the Defense Science Board Task Force put it in their 2004 report on the B-52, and I quote, "Bomber service life is based on the point where it becomes more economical to replace aircraft than to continue structural modifications and repair." Now, the US Air Force says that they intend to keep the B-52 flying all the way into the 2050s, and I realize that sounds like a long time from now. But in the world of defense procurements, it's practically the blink of an eye. The B-21 Raider program can give us a good example to look to, because it's not only a modern American bomber effort, but it's widely considered to be something of a best-case scenario for aircraft acquisitions. It has matured largely on time and on budget since its inception, which is wildly unusual in this field. Now, the B-21 that we know today emerged from the Air Force's Long-Range Strike Bomber, or LRSB effort, that kicked off in 2011. Saw its requests for industry proposals go out in 2014, and a developmental contract awarded to Northrop Grumman in 2015. And now, the first operational B-21s are expected to arrive in 2027, marking a lightning-fast ascent for such a huge technological effort, but one that still spans a total of 16 years from inception to fruition. Other recent programs weren't as quick. The F-35 took 22 years to go from inception to service. The F-22 took 24, and the B-2 Spirit took 18. If we use those numbers as a model, that means the US needs to start work on a B-52 replacement like today, if they hope to have an operational aircraft by the late 2040s, and then enough of them built by the mid-2050s to actually replace the 76 B-52s that America will still be relying on when I am in my 60s, and my daughter, who's 8 years old today, is in her mid-30s. And one more time, in 2055, the youngest B-52 airframes will be 93 years old. And lest you think I'm just pitching a new bomber program because I like to see aeronautical engineers get to work, you should know that the B-52 fleet is already showing serious signs of its age, and that is already causing real problems for the Air Force. The B-52's fleet-wide mission-capable rate has already dropped from around 78% in 2012 to just over 50% today. Now, the B-52 was originally designed for a 5,000 flight hour lifespan, or for 20 years of operational service. But thanks to continuous upgrades and maintenance, Boeing now says the remaining jets are good for somewhere between 32,500 and 37,500 total hours, limited primarily by the structural fatigue of its upper wing surfaces. Now, I wasn't able to drum up a ton of data on the average number of flight hours on the current current B-52 fleet, but with the understanding that most aircraft see roughly 250 flight hours a year, we can use the figures we've got to come up with a rough estimate for where the fleet sits today. In 1999, we know the average B-52 airframe reportedly had 14,700 flight hours, with the oldest modernized B-52Hs at 21,000. Now, at 250 hours a year over the next 27 years, that would put the average B-52 today at 21,450 hours, or about 60% through its potential lifespan, and the oldest jets at around 27,750 hours, or about 80% of the way through their lifespan. But importantly, 2 years after those figures were disclosed, the global war on terror kicked off, which saw B-52s flying a much heavier combat op tempo for years on end. In 2018, it was reported that some B-52s were flying 400 to 450 hours over just 6 to 7 month deployments, which means the B-52 fleet is, on average, probably at 70% of its service life or later. Now, armed with what was sure to be much more specific data than we could come up with here, the Air Force previously stated that it was unlikely that they could keep B-52s flying beyond 2037. Though, because the bomber no longer conducts low-level flight operations which are much more stressful on the airframe, they later revised that into the 2040s. And that is going to create problems, as today's B-52Hs are upgraded into tomorrow's B-52Js, because part of that upgrade effort is doing a thorough inspection of these partially gutted bombers for needed repairs. And as any airframe mechanic will tell you, they're gonna find corrosion and fatigue that needs to be repaired, and it is unlikely to be completely uniform across the fleet, which means each upgraded B-52J is gonna have to receive its own unique list of custom repairs, and words like unique and custom are never associated with low costs or short timelines in the world of defense contracting. And while those upgrade programs have seen their fair share of delays themselves, another issue facing these improvement efforts is the availability of B-52s in general, as the entire fleet now consists of only 75 aircraft, with only around 38 mission-ready at any given time, and a number of them required to be on standby for the nuclear deterrence mission. Take out bombers flying deterrence missions or combat operations elsewhere in the world, and you have precious few bombers that Uncle Sam can afford to pull out of duty for long enough to have new engines or avionics stuffed into them. In fact, the airframe shortage is even costing the Air Force gobs of money from other programs that aren't the bomber itself. With only one B-52 available to support testing, the aforementioned AGM-181 LRSO nuclear cruise missile that's slated to replace the AGM-86 saw a 4-month delay in testing due to the bomber's low readiness rates, which played a pretty big role in the LRSO program seeing a $347 million increase in overall costs alongside its timeline having to shift right. Now, some of this is obviously going to get better when the B-52J upgrade program is finally completed, but it is worth noting that altogether, this upgrade is expected to cost $48.6 billion. And I know we talk about a lot of big numbers on here, so they can lose their impact. So let's talk about that in context. That equates to dumping roughly $648 million into each remaining B-52. That's almost enough to replace each of these B-52s with a brand new B-21 Raider. Of course, as we've already discussed, that wouldn't make sense to do, but it does show how the cost-exchange ratio of keeping the B-52 in service is starting to shift in a pretty negative way. And that isn't a surprise to the folks paying these bills. As a part of the Air Force's 2027 budget, they included a new heavy bomber analysis of alternatives that includes exploring, in their words, quote, new heavy bomber aircraft configuration and costs. Now, this assessment will include hashing out the needs and requirements for the B-52's eventual replacement, which is the essential first step that can lead to putting out requests for proposals and getting defense firms to start sketching out their ideas. And while they have yet to disclose any of these potential requirements, they can't disclose them until they hash them out anyway, I have a few suggestions born directly out of the B-52 program that they aim to replace. This new bomber should prioritize payload and range, maybe reaching for 100,000 pounds of ordnance with an unrefueled range of at least 10,000 miles, a distance that may well already be achievable with the new B-52J. Now, the aircraft should be a bit faster, but still subsonic to avoid the heavy trade-off of supersonic fuel consumption. And it should push its service ceiling to 55,000 feet, or maybe even better, to maximize the reach of standoff weapons. Now, inside this new pickup truck of a bomber, we should rely on automation to reduce its crew requirements to just 2 pilots. It should carry the necessary hardware to control drone wingmen, and it should dramatically ramp up its internal payload capabilities via rotary launchers and larger weapon bay doors to support oversized missiles like hypersonics while maintaining a high degree of efficiency. And it should do all that for less than $500 million an airframe, which would put it smack dab in the middle between the per-unit acquisition price of the F-47 and the B-21. Of course, that's just what I think. And to be clear, the Air Force certainly hasn't asked me. But I will say this. America may have a long list of bad defense acquisitions, troubled programs, and overblown budgets behind it. But there are 2 things that no nation on this planet builds as well as the good old US of A. One of them is long-range strategic bombers, and the other one is pickup trucks. So, I think the B-52's replacements got a pretty good chance of doing just fine, as long as we remember where our priorities should be. And with that, ends this pretty long edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Download the Sandboxx News app today. That's available on iOS, and I realize that there are some issues with getting it on Android still. I'm working on it, guys. I promise I'll get back to you as soon as I know more. If you got anything out of this video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.